And we are recording on our next lecture, which is Chapter 4, which is a critical chapter for this entire semester. And so, you know, chapters 2 and 3 are very foundational for the entire semester. Chapter 4 is just the same, okay? If you struggle with these concepts in Chapter 4, and you don't really get to a point of understanding where you can do these things, the chances of you doing well this semester are kind of low because everything builds on this. And so Chapter 4 is critical. Chapter 4 is foundational. You've got to understand these fundamentals of CSS and all the ins and outs of how to write CSS. And so, as I like to do, I like to just write code and my demonstrations of these PowerPoints. So let's go ahead and open up a Chapter 4 homework folder in Visual Studio Code. And the first kind of slide talks about the different ways that you can write CSS. Now, someone remind me, when it comes to HTML, what is the purpose of HTML?
Content and structure.
All right, content and structure. So HTML is for content and structure. Okay, content being your paragraphs and your images and your videos. Structure being the header, the footer, the aside, the nav. Those are your tags for structure. Okay, CSS stands for cascading style sheet. And John, do you want to hit one set of lights? Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, great. Okay, a couple keywords in here. Style, you know, I think of style and I'm not a stylish person necessarily. I don't want to be unstylish, but I'm not a stylish person. But you think of style, that's kind of how people dress and how they maintain themselves, right? A person's style is their, like one way of defining a person's style is their clothing choices. What they look like, how they're dressed. Well, you could say if you're dressing content, what it looks like, you know, you're changing the content colors, you're changing the positioning, you're changing maybe, you know, you're adding some animation, right, to the style. And so cascading style sheets is exactly that. It is the presentation of your content, how your content looks. Just like a human being, we dress up, you know, and we all have some sort of style on a day-to-day basis. That's what CSS is used for, is the presentation of your content. The word cascade means that, and I always am reminded of when I took math classes growing up, the instructors would have a projector, and on that projector they'd put a piece of, I think it was called actate paper. It was like see-through paper, and they would write on like one colored marker, and they would start to do a math problem, and then they would put another clear piece of paper on top of that, and they'd write in another color marker, and then they'd put another piece of clear paper on top of that. And then what you would have is those papers would cascade together, and they would project a single image on the board. And so that's what the cascade means. It means that these styles that we're going to get, they're going to cascade together for a final image, which means that you can essentially get your style rules. You can get your style from many different places. The first place is a browser style sheet. And so every browser has a built-in style sheet that we kind of talked about the other day. What does that browser style sheet do? Well, it gives us like our links, for example. You know, if I just look at this, why is that link blue? Why does that link have an underline? Why does it have a font, why does it have a font that has these little accents on it, right? What is that font, and why is it that font by default? And so when you have a browser style sheet, these are kind of your default styles that each browser has. Now, what's interesting and would be nice is that if every browser had their own, if every browser had a standard style sheet. But as it turns out, that's not the case. Firefox might have a different font for links than Internet Explorer versus Edge versus Chrome versus Brave. All these are different web browsers. You need to be familiar with the various common web browsers that are out there. And so, you can kind of see Chrome, Safari, Edge, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Opera, Old Edge, right? These are kind of like the common browsers that are out there. And unfortunately, there's not a common shared browser style sheet that they all have. They all kind of have default values, and that's not really great. Okay. Well, besides the default styles, we can write styles in 3 other ways. The first way, inline. The second way would be embedded. And the third way would be external. Okay? Now, in short, inline, you want to avoid this. In short, embedded, avoid this most of the time. And external, we want to use this. Okay, so yes, you can write styles in 3 different ways, but the best practice for a lot of different reasons is to just use external links, and because external style sheets. And because that's the recommended practice, that's what I'm going to focus on, although I will show you how to do the others as well. And we can get into the pros and cons of each, but the short answer is just use external. And so an external style sheet is a separate document. So you'll notice I'll create a document called styles.css. When I give it the CSS extension, you notice we got this fancy icon that recognizes that this is its CSS document. And so the first thing to do is to create this new file. And this new file is called styles.css. Again, this is creating an external CSS file. Okay, and this is what we're going to demonstrate first. So now I've got this external CSS file. And what I need to do is I need to link this HTML document to this external CSS. I used a keyword in there, and that keyword is link. And if I use Emmet and I type in the word link, like your favorite video game character, and you hit tab, you can see there's a link tab, and it kind of fills in this rel attribute of style sheet, and then it's looking for a path, much like our anchor tags have an href attribute for a path. Like this could be http://www.google.com, right? This href attribute belongs on both anchor tags and the link tag. However, this link tag just needs to point to our styles.css. And now the magic of linking these 2 documents together is done. Our HTML document is now linked to a external CSS. Okay, and so this is the most common, this is the easiest way of doing that. Now, part of learning CSS is learning all of the various, does anyone remember, oh by the way, this is a CSS comment, what are the parts of a CSS rule? I briefly covered them in a previous lecture, but does anyone recall? Selector.
Declaration.
And the declaration.
Yeah. And the declaration is property and value.
Yeah, the declaration is broken down into a property and value. Awesome. So really, you've got a selector and a declaration. Declaration. The declaration is kind of broken down into a property and value. So those are like the new important terms that are in this chapter. Selector property value, selector property value, selector property value. So, one selector, what can we select? Well, we can select any HTML element. Okay, and keep in mind an element is a tag, right? An element includes the opening tag, the closing tag, and all the content in between. So when I say an element, I'm talking about just that, the opening tag, the closing tag, and the content in between. So I said we can select any HTML element. And so, for example, we could select this anchor tag, or we could select the body tag. Let's go ahead and just do that. Select the body tag. Now notice the curly braces. So our selector is body. That's the first piece, selector. Then we have property : value. The property in this case, we'll do background color, colon, and then we'll give it some color. Now, by the way, you notice we can give it text values, or on the right, does anyone know what these values are called? They're called hexadecimal. So on the left, we can give it text values or hexadecimal values. Turns out hex values are better. Hexadecimal hex values are considered better practice. So if you want Alice Blue, you could say Alice Blue, but you could also say F0, F8, FF with a pound in front of it. Turns out that is better. So let's do F0, F8, FF, pound, F0, what did I say, F8, FF, is that what I said? Okay, well that's what it is now. Okay, so we selected the property. We got the background color is, we selected the body. Background color is the property. The value is this hexadecimal color value. And by the way, hex color chart, if you need to look this up, there's, the reason hex is considered better than text is you can get millions of colors. And oh, by the way, Alice Blue might be one shade of blue in Chrome and another shade of blue in Firefox. So again, kind of going back to these differences between the browsers. However, a hex color is the same shade in every computer, right? So it's considered better practice to do hex. And now what I don't like about that color is it might be hard to see. So let's just go ahead and kind of shade. Oh, love Visual Studio. Look how nice that is. It changes the color for me to this nice blue. And so all I'm really trying to do here is change my background color, and if that works, the magic is working, right? So we now know our CSS is working. A big part of learning CSS is learning the different ways we can select things. Right now, we know one way to select things. We can select HTML elements. For example, we can select our anchor tags and change them to, now if I'm just typing it quickly, I'll just do like that, right? However, for best practice, I just said that that's no good. It's essentially shades of RGB. So hex values are values from 0 through F. Okay, it kind of goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then A, B, C, D, E, F. And so an F is like a 15 on that scale. And so you do RGB. So you do FF, that means that's a lot of red. So it's RGB. The first two characters are red. G, so no green, no blue. So the first two, this is your shade of red. That means a lot of red. No green, no blue. And now our anchor tags are doing that. And so let's get this kind of on one tab. Now, why does it not like this? Well, remember that in this class, we have a validator that's actively looking at your code and suggesting things. If you did not run the npm package install, then you're not going to get this. But we're just trying to write our code in a predictable fashion. So this says, expected a single space before the curly. And that makes that happy. Now this says, please use 2 spaces for indentation. Now if I count that, I got 4 spaces, 1, 2. and that gets rid of that. Now, you might say, well, a tab is 4 spaces, and so instead of tabbing over, I just do my 2 spaces, and I do that. And we got one more little error here, and I'm wondering if I got an extra space in there. Let's put that back. Why are you barking?
I just think you didn't put a space because the
Maybe I need it.
Yeah, it just pops up on its own.
Yeah, let's put. Quit barking at me. FF00. I'm getting like extensions that are one of these ways I'll get it.
Oh, you use a pretty or beautified named up. I don't think.
Okay, so let's you can format document with. It's a good idea, and beautify. And that again, so my beautify does the 4 spaces. I literally have no idea what fixed it there, but let's go ahead and put our F. That's really not the important part of the lecture, so I'm not. By the way, it could be capital or lowercase, and now I broke it again.
Mine's doing the same thing.
Format document, configure, beautify.
Yeah, I didn't put it.
Well, the challenge here is I want to see this error, but it keeps popping up this little helper. I don't want you. Go away. Oh, there it goes. Oh, it wants lowercase. Okay, couple things here. Good. Man, that was a pain to get up. Turns out when you have FF0000, this could be abbreviated to F00. The lowercase f, it did want the lowercase f instead of the capital. And the lowercase, this 2 f's can be substituted for 1 f. So if you have the same character twice, as we have here, there's a shorthand notation, which is F00, which is the equivalent of FF0000. Okay, so both are considered valid, but this particular software that we have configured wanted the shorthand instead of the other way around. Okay, so just wanted to show that quickly, how to write external CSS, and then you can kind of continue on down and style your paragraphs. Now we also learned IDs and classes, and those are other things that we can select. And so for example, if I have a paragraph with an ID of top para, then in my CSS I can select top para, and again, just kind of getting this squared away. Doesn't like purple, so we would do like a hex shade of, I don't know, purple, but I could probably select it off of this. Now you notice colors can also be RGB. So top para, there we go. And to kind of get this error message to pop up, what did I do? I had to basically put my cursor over the colon. And it says expected a single space after the colon. So let's go ahead and put a single space there, and that gets rid of that. Little picky, little picky. I would even say maybe a little excessively picky.
Yeah.
It's a little excessively picky because the CSS I'm writing is considered valid, but it's just trying to get a standard way in this class that we're all writing CSS, which is fine. How do you know ultimately if you're writing valid CSS? Because again, if you're making all these error messages happy, you're going to be writing good CSS. But if you have a couple error messages left over here, just like in HTML, there is a CSS validator. Now, what's kind of weird about this CSS validator is its URL. Notice Jigsaw, don't know what Jigsaw is, .w3.org CSS validator. And you can go right by file upload, and you can choose your external CSS document. So let's go ahead and go through that path. All student repos, there's me. There is my homework, chapter 4. There's my styles, and let's check it. And you get this, congratulations, no error messages found. So it's important to note and remember that the HTML validator, validator.w3.org, one website is for validating your HTML, one website's for validating your CSS. These are different URLs. One's at w3.org, it's validator.w3.org, and one is jigsaw.w3.org / CSS validator. Okay, these are the two validators for those two languages. Now, I will cover quickly how to write embedded CSS, and in fact, I will write embedded CSS a lot, just to demonstrate that my color of purple on my paragraph is working. Let's go ahead and format that. Alt-Shift-F. Alt-Shift-F is a quick way to format your document, so that's nice. Let's go ahead and do another paragraph with an ID of bot para with some lorem ipsum in there. So this is an example of CSS embedded, and so you got this style tag. Now external, you're going to notice there are no tags in here. Tags belong in HTML. Tags do not belong in CSS. Okay, CSS only has selector property value. The only tag related to CSS is this style tag. You're going to notice this goes up in the head of the document just like the link tag does. And once I have this style tag written, this says CSS goes in here. I'll go ahead and target bot para. And I'll say font size 30 pixels. Okay, so now my font size on my bottom paragraph is 30 pixels. And while we're doing this, we're learning some different properties. We've got the font size, we've got the color, we've got the background color. Okay, a lot of learning CSS is learning all of the various properties, right? We've learned selectors. We can select HTML elements, we can select IDs, and we can select classes. Remember how to select a class. Let's just do another link to keep in mind, a class can be applied to multiple elements. I'll call this external links class. And I can put this class, an ID should only go on one element, but a class can go on multiple, right? So now that I've got these classes, I should be able to style my external links. And I'm going to get rid of my anchor tag here. I don't want any conflicts. Text decoration none is it should remove the underlines. Now you can see the underlines on the links are gone. So text decoration of none on our links will remove underlines. A lot of CSS. Now, you guys did some CSS practice on your lab, right?
Yes.
And so is this like review, or is this new? Is it, what is this?
It's review.
Okay. So if you did the CSS yesterday on Codecademy, a lot of this is being reviewed right now, which is really good. That's why I said we could have done the hands-on test today, but I wanted more practice. Let's go ahead and write our inline CSS. So remember, external is the way to go. Embedded is right here. This is embedded CSS. And then inline is literally in the body. So I could have, for example, an unordered list with a bunch of line items. Right, remember our little Emmet tool allows us to do a UL parent with LIs times 5. And then I'm going to hold down Alt and click right here. List items. Okay. And I'm going to write some inline style. So I'll put a style attribute. So on this list, I'm going to put a style attribute, and it's probably not even going to like this. It says, hey, don't write inline style. Our validator literally says don't do this, although it can work. I'll do list style type. Ooh. Validate crash due to a configuration error. It really doesn't like what I'm doing. That's fine. List style type of none. And what that's going to do, again, it really doesn't like embedded style. So I have the selector in this case is the unordered list. We're literally selecting it by typing the style attribute in the list. Okay, so we don't really have to write a selector at that point. You just write the property list style type, the value of none. And what that does is it gets rid of our bullets. So when I say list style type of none, gets rid of bullets. There's other list style types of like I haven't really tested a lot of these, but lower alphabetical list.
So that kind of took that one ordered list and turned it into an ordered list?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, you're exactly right. It took the unordered list and forced it into an ordered list. Because again, if you take this off, let's just cut, save, and look at it. We got bullets. Put that back on there. There you go. So those are the 3 ways that you can write CSS. Turns out, the way that these are loaded, now keep in mind, this is the cascade. You're seeing the cascade. We have external style sheets and embedded and inline, and they're all working together. So you're witnessing the cascade here. But what happens, do you think, if our external links, let's say color of brown. So just to test that, you can see that we have brown links. So here, this is our embedded style sheet, color brown. Let's take our external links in our external CSS and do color red, something totally green. Okay, so here's the deal. Our external links are saying green, but then embedded we have brown. Which one wins? And the answer comes in the answer can be found out by which one is applied last. So these rules are applied in this order. They're applied external first, then they're applied embedded, finally the inline rules are applied. So I just want you to imagine that the first rules that are loaded are making these links green. So for a split second, these links go green until the embedded runs, in which case we've got the same selector. When the selector is the same, the one that's closer to the content wins. When the selectors are the same, the one that's closer to the content wins. You would all agree that embedded is closer to the content than external. And you would also agree that inline is closer to the content than embedded, right? So what you have here is you've got the same selector, and the one that's closer to the content wins. So as I mentioned before, these should be brown, and there you have it. Our links, when you have conflicting rules and the selectors are the same. Now, oftentimes what you have is you have different selectors. If you have different selectors in conflicting rules, it's a little bit different. So when the selectors are the same, the one that's closer to the content wins. When the selectors are different, the selector that's more specific wins. Okay, so let me ask you a question. What is more specific? Selecting a paragraph or selecting something by ID? Which would you guess is more specific?
An ID.
Yeah, giving something an ID is more specific than targeting all the paragraphs. So for example here, when I do this, I am targeting all the paragraphs. If I've got 15 paragraphs, I'll just do 3 paragraphs. 1, 2, 3. I've got 3 paragraphs. This is selecting all the paragraphs. Okay, it's not just selecting one. And I'll do background. Let's it's kind of fun as you could just play with. I don't know what I want to do here. Let's push all the paragraphs over. Margin from the left, 100 pixels. Okay, so that's going to push all the paragraphs over. So you can see all the paragraphs are pushed over from the left. Targeting something by ID is considered more specific than targeting a generic paragraph tag. So when the selectors are different, the selector that's more specific wins. So if you have, like for example, the generic paragraph selector that says color red, but you've got an ID that says color blue, the ID will win over the generic. And there's a whole set of rules on what makes it more specific. Okay, so again, there is a sequence. What's not in here is actually the default styles from the browser. Those are loaded first. The default styles from the browser, then your external style sheets, then your embedded styles, then your inline styles. Now, since I'm talking about this so much, that browsers have different defaults, okay? Turns out some smart people got together and they said, you know what? Let's just set all the defaults to a default. Some smart people got together and they made a CSS document called Normalize. And so there is this thing called Normalized.css. And this is basically a CSS document that will set all of the browsers, all the different browsers, to have the same defaults. Okay, so in short, this is always a best practice to include a normalized CSS, right? Always include it. You got to download it once, and then you could just copy it, or you could download it every time. But the process is this. You're going to click on this big download button, and you're going to get confused because you're going to see that you didn't really download anything, right? It's going to take you to this text page. This is MIT license, whatever, which means it's free and open for you to use. At this point, you got to right-click and save as, and then you're going to save it in your homework folder. And this is my Chapter 4 homework, and just call it Normalize. Okay. So now that I have Normalized CSS in here, let me do a save all. Okay, these are still red because I have not committed them to GitHub. Then the next important thing, now that I've got Normalize in my folder, now I just want to link to it. And it's just done like that. So you notice I'm going to link to Normalize before I link to my own custom styles. Okay, and that's always what you want to do. Why do you want to do that? Well, it just goes, again, because it's the order that they're loaded. It's going to load Normalize first, and then if there's any conflicting selectors, if you have a selector that conflicts with Normalize, it'll use yours instead of using Normalize's. Right? So if Normalize turns it black and you turn it purple, you're going to win. Okay? For that reason, it's important to always link to Normalize before or higher in the document. Like mine's on line 15, and then the custom CSS is on line 16. Okay? So in short, always use Normalize and always link to it before you link to your custom CSS. Bunch of rules here. Okay, and you can kind of see more code, Normalize, and what it does. We talked about that. Now, one thing here, sometimes it's common to put your styles in a folder. So now I've got a Normalized CSS and Styles CSS. So let's go ahead and make a folder called Styles. And let's go ahead and drop these files in here. And wait a minute. We lost all of our styles. Or did we? Let's go back here. We didn't lose all of our styles, but background color, let's come back here. Okay, there it goes. Just took a second. We lost a lot of our styles. In fact, we lost all of our external styles. Why did we lose our external styles? Well, now they're in a styles folder, so you got to update the path. Styles / it's in a subfolder, right? So now our path to our external style sheets need to represent that folder. Okay, let's take 10 minutes. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, we're back. Where we left off was talking about some of the units of measure. And so when I kind of came into the CSS that I was writing before, I said font size 30 pixels. And a lot of people are just familiar with a pixel in the sense they've maybe had a pixel go out on their television, right? And what happens when a pixel goes out on your television is like a little black dot. And for the longest time, a pixel was defined as, you know, a dot, basically the smallest dot on your screen. By the way, MDN, Microsoft Web Docs, is a really good resource. So if you're, you know, if you're in the HTML world and you're talking about what are the good resources to use, MDN is typically one of them. And so, like here, this is on the MDN web docs, CSS Values and Units. And so again, we kind of understand that a pixel, like in the tradition of what we know, like on our televisions, is the smallest dot on a screen. Well, in CSS, they define a pixel as 1 pixel is 1/96th of 1 inch. And so let me make sure, you know, this slide could actually be updated to be a pixel is a single dot on a screen. That's kind of the old definition. A more modern definition of a pixel is 1/96th of 1 inch. And this changed a couple of years ago. And so this slide used to be more accurate, but it's been updated. Whereas a point is 1/72nd of 1 inch. And so you can see that is updated. And these are considered absolute length of units. Then you got centimeters and millimeters and all sorts of different measurements that could be considered absolute lengths. In other words, they're just a measurement. They're an absolute measurement. Relative units are relative to something else. And so, you know, absolute measurements are more, you know, as their name suggests, absolute. Well, relative means relative to what? So if I use the distance a mile, we know that a mile is an absolute distance, and we know how to measure a mile and its length. But if I say a mile north of my house, well, now that turns a mile into a relative distance, right? A mile north of my house is a different location on the map than a mile north of your house, right? That when you start making it relative, then that ends up giving you something different. So the relative measurements that we also have on these slides are things like ems. These are pronounced ems, rems. Okay, so an em, an em, pronounced like the letter M. An M is the height of the uppercase M of the font of the current element. Now, different fonts have different sizes for their capital letter M, right? Some fonts are bigger in nature, some fonts are smaller in nature, but basically you pick your font, so it's relative to the font of the current element, right? So if you're working in a paragraph and that paragraph has a font, we're talking about 1M is equal to the capital letter M. 2 M's, 2 EMs is twice the size of the capital letter M of that paragraph. 0.5 EMs, 0.5 is half the size of the capital letter M of that current element. Okay, so when we're measuring M's, we're relative to the font of the current element. Maybe it's a paragraph, maybe it's an anchor tag, what have you. A rem, well, you add the letter R and it makes it fancy, right? The letter R, rem, means the root. The root, really, of our HTML document is the HTML tag. So we're talking about the font size of the HTML element, which is considered our root. Now, it's possible that our root has a different font than a paragraph does. Okay, so it is possible that rems are different than ems, right? Because again, current element versus the root element, and that's the difference. A percentage is relative to the current value. So whatever the current font size is, it will be scaled up or down based on the current font size, the value of the current font size. Yep.
Does that have to do with like even with the default style sheet of the browser?
Yeah, it does account into the default style sheet as well. So I'll give you an example. If the root, let's just say the root HTML tag is 30 pixels, and then you say the paragraph tag is 200%, it would be double, right? But then inside of the paragraph tag, so if the root is 30, the paragraph would be 60. Okay? Now let's go inside of the paragraph and say there's a span tag inside of there. And we say another 200%. That span is 200%. Well, it's at 60 pixels, and we're going to go 200% of that, which is going to be 120 pixels. So it's just looking at the current size, and keep in mind that all these tags are within one another, so they're kind of growing bigger relative to the current value. And then the VH is the viewport height. Again, kind of going back to our, what is VW and VH? Viewport is basically your monitor's height and your monitor's width. And now keep in mind, you might be viewing this website on a tablet, you might be viewing it on a cell phone, right? So like 1 VH is 1% of the viewport height. So it's 1% of the screen's height. Right? 100 VH is 100% of the viewport height. And so VH is viewport height, VW is viewport width. It turns out that, you know, we kind of say up here that these measurements, some of these measurements like pixels and points are absolute measurements. But it is relative to the screen density. The screen density is kind of like your pixel density, in that basically how many pixels can you get in like an inch of space. So it really boils down to, even though we say that some of these measurements are absolute, like 1 pixel might be bigger than another pixel, depending on the screen. And so kind of makes it hard to work with, but it's nice because what's the preferred method in 2022? We want our measurements to be relative, because we're working with so many different devices. We want them to respond kind of proportionally on these different devices. So it's good in a lot of ways that a lot of our measurements kind of will respond to the device that they're on, which makes sense for 2022. One thing that we haven't touched on with CSS is adding borders. And so it's actually kind of cool to know that here is a selector. It's a wildcard selector for star. And star basically means select every element and do a border thin solid black. And what it boils down to is that all of our HTML elements have borders. By turning the borders on, you can see this. Now you might go, why is this important? Well, sometimes you might want to put borders like at the bottom of your headings. And so if I kind of go in here and I say, I've got an H1, this is a heading. You know, instead of putting, I might select my H1 and I'll do a border on the bottom, thin solid black. Okay, so this is kind of our shorthand. Thin means how thick is it? You could do 5 pixels. Solid is the style, black is the color. Border bottom means apply a border just to the bottom of our H1s. So now you can see that our heading, and there's our border on the bottom. It's also really good to see borders because when we start seeing the borders that are around all of our elements, we can start to understand how to move these things around, right? To understand that, for those of you who did the lab in chapter 3, you might have studied the box model. And then to understand the box model, you have to understand that everything on a web page is just a bunch of boxes. And to see the boxes, you got to turn the borders on. The way to turn the borders on is with this border property, which, by the way, this is shorthand for 3 properties. There's border width, which is 5 pixels, border style, which is solid, border color, which is black. So this one line right here is shorthand for those 3 things.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So is it possible to, with the star, like that selects everything, is it possible to like use the star but then deselect like a very specific thing?
One thing about the star is it's not considered good practice to use it. So
Okay.
even though I'm demonstrating it here, I would avoid doing that. The reason why it's considered bad practice is that basically, I'm trying to think how to word this. There's a lot of elements, and you want to be specific about what you want to do to each one. And this is just too generic in the sense that we might be applying a bunch of rules to a bunch of elements, and it boils down to that might not be the most efficient way of getting the job done. Like, you want to be specific. You want to target things specifically, not generically. But to answer your question more directly, so first off, don't use the star selector. Second off, the way to unselect something, which is what your question was, would be to overwrite that. So for example, this is on everything, right? This is so then I could do border : none here, and that would basically overwrite this. And this is a more specific selector than this. So on my bottom paragraph, it should turn the selector off, and you can see that there's really no.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of possible that way, but again, that's in short, that's what borders are. Borders are kind of hard to learn in the sense that, well, there's the shorthand, then there's the longhand. There's a long way of coding this. Oh, by the way, this is border width on all 4 sides. Well, what if you just want? What if you don't? What if you just want? Border bottom width 5 pixels. Border bottom color red. Border. So what it boils down into, border color width and style, and there's like a dash line, right? Now I turn border bottom on all of these, except for this one that I overwrote. So it boils down to there's a lot of different ways that you can code these borders. The easiest way is the shorthand, but that shorthand is for all 4 sides. There's also border bottom shorthand, which is 5 pixels solid red. There's also I don't think you would really ever do this on a website that looks pretty terrible, but you get the point. There's shorthands for borders, and there's a bunch of different ways to write it. Kind of the same thing for fonts. When you break down like borders, there's like 20 different properties that we just covered. Same thing for fonts. There's like 20 different fonts.
Is there like a border length?
Good question. John says, is there a border length? Meaning you don't want, see this heading? It goes all the way across the screen. So why is that border so long? Turns out that heading is that long. And if you don't want that heading to be that long, we could go into the heading and shorten the heading. So let's go into my H1 and maybe say 50%. See that? That's going to change your border length. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, they answered.
You could do percent. You could do 100 pixels.
Oh, my next question is, when you're in the CSS style, does it matter like what order you write everything?
Good question. So up here, if I say red 5 pixel solid, still works, right? So our values are kind of interchangeable there. What if I take this top para and I put it up here? Still works. So CSS is pretty flexible, John.
Okay, and then does it? I guess would it matter like if you were to put like the color before the font, or the font size and the font style? Or?
Nope. Good question, but no. Actually, you could do like font size first, or you could do the font size second. These are all good questions.
Actually, going back to the inline CSS. So when it comes to like the those inline tags like strong or emphasis, can you also modify those CSS inline, or do you need to do those through a style sheet, or can you do both?
So the question is, could I write some inline CSS right on this strong tag? Sure can.
Is that bad practice?
Yeah, I don't like. It's not that I don't like it, but it's not the most efficient way to code with inline CSS. It can be done. To answer John's question, it is not considered good practice to answer Vinny's. Good questions. And somewhere in there, I got my bold and funny colored Amet. You guys might learn some Latin. You stick around in this class long enough.
So then you can style that strong tag in the external CSS document, or you can
Yeah. We could style this over here. So we could go into our CSS document, target the strong tag, and say color dark gray. Still works. Yeah, let's go ahead and, open up your browsers and just go to developer.mozilla.org. And you see documenting web technologies, including CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. And let's just throw this on your bookmarks. And, if you ever need to look something up, this is your first resource. Okay, this is where I want you to go first. Maybe even before Google, right? You should always, everyone should know how to Google things, but this is a good resource for web development. Okay, and so like if you want to learn about pixels, CSS Pixel. The term CSS Pixel is synonymous with CSS absolute length px, which is normatively defined as being exactly 1/96 of 1 inch. All right, so that's borders. Not to harp on borders. The most important thing, in my opinion, about borders is to understand that everything has a border. Everything has a border. And it has a border on 4 sides. And that when you turn the borders on, you see the boxes of the box model. Okay, what is the box model? The box model is how we're going to position things and move things around. And the box model is one of the harder parts of understanding CSS. Okay, changing colors and font sizes, turns out that's really not the hardest part of CSS. CSS actually had versions, and in CSS version 1, which was somewhere in the 90s, CSS version 1, you had things like font sizes, colors, you know, some of those basics. CSS version 2, which is inclusive of version 1, deals with positioning. Looks weird to me. Moving things around on the screen. So we're really, when we're learning CSS here, we're really learning this version 1 right now. And then we'll learn version 2, which again includes version 1. And then we'll learn some CSS version 3 and more modern stuff. Okay, so borders. So here's a couple of recommended practices for us for this class. And in fact, this slide is important enough. I'm going to go ahead and take a screenshot of it and kind of put it here in the chat. And these are just some kind of rules of thumb, if you will, some recommendations, okay? And these are just from our experience as instructors, kind of what works well. And so when it comes to like setting the root font size, okay, what is the root? That's the HTML tag. Use pixels. When it comes to borders, use pixels. Similar to borders is an outline, use pixels. When it comes to font sizes, when it comes to margin and padding and width and height, we're going to use rems, root ems, right? When it comes to VH and VW, when we start positioning things, we're going to use VH and VW. So for page layout, that's what we're going to do. So I think that's important enough to go ahead and put that in chat as our recommendations. Because it turns out with CSS, there's like 100 ways you could do things. And so these are just our recommended ways of doing things. We already talked about the text values for red, the RGB values for red, as far as hexadecimal values. And then there's also the RGB, kind of like the color wheel, 100% red, 40% green, 20% blue. And then there's the numeric values, 0 to 255. So you could do percentages RGB or number values. Again, 100 ways of doing colors. Probably, again, right here, most graphic designers are using hexadecimal because it gives you 16 million colors. Right? So hex is really considered best practice there. Okay, already demonstrated that, You know, I never thought about accessibility for colors until MySpace. I got a funny story about this. You know, if you remember MySpace, for anybody who was on social media in the early 2000s, right? MySpace was before Facebook. And MySpace would give you access to the HTML and the CSS so you could design your profile. And turns out, ultimately, one of the big reasons why MySpace failed and Facebook didn't is that Facebook did not allow people to like all these videos and all these audio files, which in the early 2000s, not everyone could have a high internet speed to download these large files, right? So people on MySpace are putting all these videos and all these audio files, and they would take a while to download, and it just got choppy. And so it gave a choppy experience in a lot of cases on MySpace, whereas Facebook was like white background, blue text, black text, real simple, real fast. And so early on, that was a big reason why MySpace failed and Facebook didn't. But, you know, my MySpace, you know, I kind of grew up in the 90s, and I watched Saved by the Bell. And so Saved by the Bell, I made my MySpace, I had these Saved by the Bell images. And if you ever remember Saved by the Bell, lots of neon colors. It was like this early 90s theme, if you will. High neon, bright colors. And then I had white font, all right? Turns out that white font on top of neon colors is like, you can't read it whatsoever, right? So I learned this concept of contrast. And contrast means that you got a background color that when you put a different text color on top of the background that is readable. So things that contrast well, you know, for example, a white text on a black background, right? You got light font color and you got a dark background color, or the inverse of that, right? If you've got a white background, you've got dark forecolors. And so contrast is really important, specifically for the visually impaired. I think statistically, something like 1 in 10 people have some sort of color impairment. So it's more common than you might think. And so that's the rule of thumb, is to have good contrast. And if you ever want good contrasting colors, the organizations in our society that have perfected this, a lot of sports teams have good contrasting colors. You know, so you can kind of click through here, and a lot of times you find examples of good contrasting colors. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of money in sports, and they've all had professionally designed logos, and they're not going to have, you know, bad colors for the most part. Although, any hockey fans out there?
My dad is. Speaking of the Blues.
I've got a few links with regard to like color design, and I think you might have shared this. The color blindness simulator, or I might have found it somewhere.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead and share that. I could make a case. I think there's like some new teams in the NHL that are pretty crappy logos. Not that it matters. Or you just look at the colors and you go, oh, that's terrible. Oh, maybe that wasn't bad. That's it. The Seattle hockey team. Yeah, maybe it's not so bad. They at least contrast well.
I think they're probably trying to keep it.
I think it was cool.
Similar with like.
Yeah, I think that looks sick, actually.
Do you like that?
Yeah.
I don't even care what team it is.
Yeah, the Seattle Kraken. All right, not my taste. That's okay. But they do contrast well, so it was not a good point. I did not make a good point. All right, back to the slideshow. Accessibility for colors. There's also a RGBA, and A stands for alpha, which is the opacity. So if you want to make text that is see-through, right? You want to make see-through text, you can do RGBA. You can also do hue, saturation, and lightness, HSL for color, or HSLA. And so these are all ways, HSLA and RGBA are, again, these are both ways to have transparent text and make it see-through. So there's RGBA. It's a little bit transparent. If you had a background color, they would kind of, you'd see that background through the text color. Selecting things by element type, IDs, and classes, right? We know that these are the ways that we can select things in CSS. Element type, ID, and classes. So here's 3 ways to select things. Turns out there's more than 3. Turns out there's more than 3 ways. And you have to understand, to use these other selectors, you have to understand that HTML, this is actually a very important slide, HTML can be thought of like a family tree. And so you have tags inside of other tags inside of other tags. And when you, for example, if you have a main tag, and then its first child is an H1, its second child is a UL. Well, inside of those ULs, you've got LIs, and inside of those LIs, you have anchor tags. Okay, so here what we have is we have main is a parent to H1, UL, H2, so on and so forth. So main is the parent, and these tags are the children, okay, of main. So these are direct childs. Okay, a descendant is anything that's underneath main. So all of these tags are considered descendants. So you have got direct children, and then you've got all of these tags that are descendants. The opposite of that is ascendant, right? Anything above it in the hierarchy. And then you've got siblings. You would say that all of these are siblings. So as it turns out, you can select elements based on these relationships in CSS. Now, why might you do that? Why would you select something based on, why wouldn't you just put an ID on this and an ID on that and an ID over here and an ID over here and an ID over here and an ID over here? Well, you could. You could bloat your HTML with IDs and classes. When I use the word bloat, I think of software bloat. We all have cell phones, and they come preloaded with software that we might not even want on our cell phones. Okay? Well, it's kind of the idea here. We could bloat our HTML with IDs and classes. And that would make our CSS, we could select things really easily with our CSS. But if we're a little bit better about how to select things in our CSS, we might do this. So let's go inside here. I'm just going to kind of clean this up. And I'll make a main tag with a div with an unordered list, li times 5. So we got main div ul li. So if I say, let's add a paragraph. And H1. And that's good enough. So if I say, okay, let's select main div H1. This says select the H1 that is a child of a div that is a child of main. Let's get rid of all this other stuff. Well, what did I just do there? I avoided adding an ID to my H1. And I just selected that one H1. If I had a different H1, it does not select that H1 because it's not a child of div, which is not a child of main. Why is this considered bloat? Why is adding a bunch of IDs and a bunch of classes considered bloat? Well, it increases our HTML file size. Increasing the file size means it takes people longer to download, right? Now, today's high-speed internet, and these files are so small, this negligible is really not a big difference. But if you do it enough, if you throw enough IDs and enough classes in your HTML, it might increase the file size enough that if someone's downloading your site with a slow connection, that it slows it down. Okay, so it's something to be mindful of. I don't hate IDs. I don't avoid them in all cases. But if I can write my CSS in a more efficient way, then that's considered a good thing, right? Without giving everything IDs. There is it's an old article that I always like to pull up at this point and say, look, there's a bunch of ways this is, wow, they repurposed this back in 2020. The star selector, selecting things by ID, selecting things by class, selecting things by their element type. This combination selector, that's what I did. This says select all the anchor tags inside of list items. This is referred to as an adjacent selector. It will select only the elements that is immediately preceded by the former element. So in this case, only the first paragraph after each UL. So in other words, we could put a paragraph above this UL, we could put a paragraph below that UL. Okay? And if I do UL plus P, it's only the second paragraph, right? Because it is immediately after the UL.
Well, it'd be different if it was P plus UL.
It would be different if it was P plus UL, right? So go ahead and bookmark those 30 CSS selectors you must memorize, and read through this list. Again, the various ways you know to select CSS, the more you know about CSS selectors, the better at writing CSS you will be. Put it that way. You'll go through an evolution of like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Like, okay, I know I can select elements, and now I can select IDs, and now these adjacent selectors, and parents, and children, and grandparents, and all these different ways. And the book, chapter 4, covers all of these topics, and in fact, your homework has you selecting things based on relationships. Okay, adjacent sibling, again, based on, are you a sibling that is next to, so this is the paragraph that is a sibling of an H2, meaning right next to it. And this means general sibling, right? So this is an adjacent paragraph to the H2, right? Whereas a general sibling is any one of these 3 paragraphs. So are you adjacent or are you general sibling?
So that would make it anything change and using that it would do
all 3.
Okay.
Yeah, this would do all 3 paragraphs. This would do only the adjacent paragraph. This would select the adjacent paragraph. You can also select multiple selectors. So like this selects all the H1s, 2s, and 3s and change them all to blue. So just separate them with commas. This says select all the paragraphs. And all the children LIs inside of the UL with a class of speakers. So this says the unordered list with a class of speakers, select all of the LIs inside of it. Which is, I kind of skipped over this one, which is the first one. A selector for an element by its type and class. Its type and class. So an unordered list with a class of speakers. And finally, you have attribute selectors, and these are mainly used on a couple of ways, on anchor tags. So this says select all of the anchor tags with href attributes, which is kind of to say all of your anchor tags, because all anchor tags have hrefs. This says all elements with href, so you'll notice the attribute is in brackets. This says select all of the input tags with an attribute type of submit. So when you see these angle brackets in your selector, that says it's selecting based on the value or based on the attribute. So notice this is the attribute type and the value is submit, which is, what is that? That's a submit button. No shortage of slides on this one, but I like to take breaks every hour. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, give you guys a breather. Okay, where we left off are on these things called pseudo classes. So I never really broke down that word in my mind. You know, a CSS class is an attribute in HTML, and then you target that attribute with the dot, right? So remember that an ID, you target an ID with a pound, and you target a class with a dot. So, you know, dot blue para would be like that, right? So that's how you target a class called blue paras. Pseudo class, right? Kind of a class. Interesting to think about. Pseudo kind of a class. These are really common. So let's say in all of our line items, in all of our list items rather, we have an anchor tag that's a dummy tag, links. You kind of saw me earlier target the anchor tag and do color red, and that was working. But it turns out that links actually have more states. And so you might notice, like, let's just take this out. You might notice, like, the default is that links are blue until they're clicked and then they go purple, right? So links can become visited links. And visited links have they can have a different style than links that haven't been visited. And so you would call that a state of a link. And so there's a::link. There's also a:: a visited link. There's also links that can be hovered. And there's also links that are considered active, like in the moment they're being clicked. And so you could, to style a link, these are the states of a link. And you style them using these pseudo class selectors, kind of like classes. It's not a dot link, it's a:: link. It's a pseudo class. A:: visited, a:: hover, a:: active. And now we can say color is blue and text decoration is none. And now all of our links and all of our link states are always going to be the same, right? So you're not going to get different color links at different times. And when you're hovering a link, you know, you're not going to, you might even add :hover, and you probably see a lot of websites have hover effects, text decoration of solid. Actually, instead of text decoration, background. You know, you get these little hover effects, right? So you hover over a link, and you see a lot of websites that give a little interactivity this way. So the hover is inclusive. It gets both the color of blue, the text decoration of none, and uniquely, it's got the background color of red. And so these are called, again, these are called pseudo classes, and these are really common in CSS. Now, the latest version of CSS, you kind of heard me say this before, the latest version of CSS is CSS version 3. And CSS version 3 allows us to select things like the first child. So a div with the first child. So let's do this. Let's do div with a child paragraph times 5. Fill up lorem ipsum and all of our paragraphs. And let's target the div : first child. Color red. And I didn't do it right.
Did you save?
I did save. And so one of the things about CSS3 is browser compatibility. So I'm going to assume it's not a browser compatibility. CSS first child. P : first child. Oh, okay, I did it wrong. So P : first child. The paragraph that is the first child of a parent. That's what I did. This is the paragraph that is the first child of a parent. So now, hey, there we go. Last child would work the same way. Only child? Interesting. So let's do a div that's an only child. Div with one paragraph. CSS comment different than an HTML comment. / star * CSS comment different than an HTML comment. HTML comment angle bracket exclamation point hyphen hyphen. Don't like it, but it is what it is. Let's go back to this. Font size large gives us a slightly larger font size. So those are some CSS3 pseudo classes.
Only child is kind of odd, because I mean, at that point, then you would just do like target, say for that div. It's probably going to have a class, and then you target the paragraph tag.
Yeah, you're right. There's other ways of doing it, but notice as soon as I put another child in there, it doesn't work. Whereas that way, it still would potentially select that one. I don't know. I don't really use first, only child all that often, but it's something. It's a tool to have in the toolbox. So demonstrated those, and they also have first letter. Literally. When I think of first letter, I think of like a Harry Potter textbook. And you go to a Harry Potter textbook, and they really try and get like that first letter to stand out and like be an attention getter, And so a lot of times websites might consider doing that, like have the first letter that's a big attention getter in a unique font to draw the reader in. A lot of times hover versus focus, you want to style them the same way. Why? Hover is done with a mouse. Focus is done with a keyboard. So you could tab and receive focus on a control. Hover would be like hovering an anchor tag versus tabbing onto an anchor tag or a link. And you want to give the users the same experience whether they're using a mouse or a keyboard is the short version of that. Some people with shaky hands, they have a hard time using a mouse, so they use a keyboard instead. You want to give them the same experience. There is a unique way of kind of changing the default. CSS rules have a default behavior on how they're applied, and we kind of touched on that with the cascading order. Inline styles are the most important, right? So inline styles are like closer to the content. But then there's an important tag that would override normal rules in a style sheet. So you got normal rules in a style sheet. So it's like default web browser, then normal rules in your custom style sheet. Then if you apply any rule with this important tag, and so there's a whole, remember I said how specific a selector is, depends on if it overrides the other rules. And so there is kind of like, again, some rules of thumb here. Type selectors, then classes, then IDs. So IDs are more specific than classes. Classes are more specific than types. You'll notice here how using important is considered bad practice and should be avoided because it makes debugging more difficult, breaking the natural cascade in your style sheets. Okay, so yes, there is this important exception, however, don't use it. And if people are using it, like, you got to understand it, but like here is how you would apply the important on an attribute selector on a class of foo. Again, MDN has the best docs. A lot, as you'll continue through your career, a lot of documentation for developers is not that great, but the documentation for HTML and CSS is pretty doggone good. And this MDN web docs is where it's at. Bad practice. And we talked about, so an element or pseudo element, pseudo selector, is least specific. A class attribute or pseudo class selector is more specific than that. A composite or relational selector is more specific than simple selectors. So for example, a paragraph that is a child of a div is more specific than just the paragraph selector. So those relational selectors are more specific than simple, and then IDs are most specific. Okay, I've been using Chrome developer tools all along the way. Let me do one more demonstration on Chrome Developer Tools because these are pretty awesome. With Chrome Developer Tools, notice here we've got this paragraph that's in only child. F12 is the hotkey, right, to pull up the developer tools in Windows. Okay, so that's the first thing. Or you can right-click and click Inspect. Now, I don't like putting this over on the right-hand side. My preference is to dock it at the bottom because it kind of gets out of the way at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close this tab that says What's New because that's not really important for us. Okay, so that gives us the most real estate to work with. And what you're going to see on this left-hand pane is you're going to see my HTML. And you can see that as I move my mouse, it kind of selects that area of the HTML. And if I actually click on this paragraph, over here on the right-hand side, you can see the CSS that's being applied. And if you look here, it'll even tell you what line number that's coming from. So this P only child is coming from my index HTML line 22. So troubleshooting web development is learning how to use this tool, the web developer toolkit or whatever, the inspect tool, and understanding the cascade and understanding the rules of specificity and figuring out, you're going to see that, this rule conflicts with this rule, and this rule is more specific than that rule. That's why my font's red and my font's not green. Right? So I've been using this tool for more than a decade now, and I'm a big fan of it. And it will help you immensely if you learn how to use it. Now there's also, again, you can hover over here. There's also the inspect element right here. You can kind of inspect the page, click on it, and then it'll show you, I got a font size 2 EMs. This font size of 2 EMs comes from Normalized Css. Remember what Normalized does. Right? It also has some margin. And I can turn that margin off by unchecking it. Now you're saying it doesn't really move anything. Well, because the browser margin is kind of the default. There's some default margin there, which is coming from the user agent style sheet. So there is some default margin being applied here. So that unchecking this doesn't really make a difference because the browser style sheet still applies the margin. And you can't uncheck that because you have no control over that. We have covered so much information, and there's still more to go. There's not a lot more to go. A little bit more to go. So hang in with me, because we are almost done, I think. Slide 40 talks about, or maybe I'm just bluffing, maybe we got a lot more to go. Font families. Okay, there's specific fonts like Arial, but then there's font families that fonts go into. Fonts are categorized into one of 5 font families. Generically speaking, serifs are fonts that have those accents like Times New Roman. Here you can see this top Times New Roman has accents. The I, the T's, they have little accents, little flares, if you will. The T on the Times New Roman has a flare. Okay, so serif fonts have these serifs, which are basically the flares on the fonts. These are your attention-getting fonts. You know, they're there to get someone's attention. A lot of times they're used in headings, the attention getters. Sans serif simply means without serif. So any font that doesn't have a serif, a good common font is Arial. That is widely used. One of the most widely used fonts on the web would be Arial. Helvetica would be another common font. Okay, that is a very common font that is in the sans serif category. Okay, the sans serif font category. So let's do most common fonts on the web. And you're going to see Arial, you know, Arial Black is just Arial. Verdana, Tahoma. So Verdana is another sans serif. Come on, where's my Helvetica? Okay, well, regardless. Why are these? Oh, this is good. Are fonts say fonts necessary? Okay. Arial. Baskerville. Again, a headline in Baskerville. Again, they got the serifs on it. It's another serif font. Why is this important? Well, you want your content to be readable. Turns out that Arial is just extremely easy to read, right? So you want to make your text easy to read so people read the content on your site and they buy your widgets. So that's why serif fonts are for headings. Sans serif are for your paragraphs and your actual content, your lists and so forth. Monospace is like a typewriter. Cursive is what it is. I understand they don't even teach cursives in schools anymore. I don't know if that's true or not. Hopefully that's not true. Did you guys learn cursive in grade school?
I did.
I learned it in 3rd grade, like for one lesson, and that was it.
What?
Yeah, I will say my kid hasn't even mentioned cursive, so I think it's a long gone thing.
What? Got to sign your name on a check, don't you?
I mean, checks will be done probably within the next 5 years. Who knows?
It checks by. Yeah. When's the last time you wrote a check? I haven't written a check in a long time. Good point.
I've never written a check.
Never.
When I made my bank account, my dad was like, "Where's your checks?" I'm like, "Dad, we're in 2022."
Dad, Venmo.
Yeah. Exactly.
Dad.
Back in like 2018 even.
Cash App, Dad. Come on. Fantasy are for like your extravagant fonts. I will say that Google Fonts is where it's at. Because there are fonts that are loaded on your computer, but a lot of computers don't have. I mean, there's really creative fonts that are out there. You know, that something like this could be used on any website. Let me show you how to use. Let's just say you got this font that you like, and let's go ahead and select it, and then you click dismiss, and then you click. Let's see. Now you can download it and then link to it, but I actually kind of like this import. And with this import, we're just going to put this little style tag up in the head. So check this out. So we're gonna add another embedded style sheet, or we could just add to our embedded style sheet. So since I already have a style tag, let's go ahead and add this little this is called a CSS3 font. Okay, and this is a really unique rule, right, that allows us to use this font. And then now let's apply the font family to a heading. So we're going to target our H1, font family, and then we got the name of our font that we imported right here. And now we've got the font. So Google Fonts are amazing, and when it comes to making beautiful websites, there's just, I would say the first and most important thing are the images on your site. And the colors would be, second. I don't even know that I want to. These are all important things. Colors, images are extremely important. Colors are extremely important. And fonts. The actual fonts that you use, those three things right there, super simple concepts, but important for making beautiful, good-looking websites. Now, you might have noticed that the font family kind of has a fallback. It says try Times New Roman. If font Times New Roman, by the way, since there's spaces, it's got quotes around it. Single quotes, could be double quotes. But since there's spaces on the font, then try Times, then try the generic, whatever the default serif font is for your computer. So this is kind of a normal when you have a font family to have a fallback. It tries Arial, then it tries Helvetica, then it tries sans serif font. Whatever generic sans serif font is on your computer. So font family is the CSS property, and you normally write it with having fallbacks. And they did here too. They said font family of this fallback to cursive, whatever the generic cursive font is for your computer. And you could change that to something else. If that font doesn't load for whatever reason, the website goes down, googleapis.com goes down. Fonts.googleapis. By the way, googleapis.com. Something to check out. Not important to this. Okay, keep in mind, applying something to the body. Well, we said HTML, is the root element. Well, body is also kind of a parent of all of your content. So you can apply rules at the HTML level. You can apply rules at the body level. Whereas in the body, basically everything in the body will be Arial except for the paragraphs. Those paragraphs will be Times New Roman. Right? So this overrides because paragraphs are more specific than bodies. Otherwise, all paragraphs would inherit Arial. Font style is how you can make font italic. Font weight is how you can make something bold. Font variant, give you a nice little link. Let's check out this link for font variant. The font various CSS shorthand property allows you to set all the font variants for a font. So font variant is like small caps. You can make everything like capital letters. So I've seen this a lot where a font, people want to set it to all caps. And so
You have the text transform to do that.
let's see. Oh, there it goes. So here's font variant for small caps. You notice all the text. So here's font variant normal. Is just whatever you type it in the HTML is what it does. Here's small caps. This is kind of the tabular numbers. Again, it's kind of changing the formatting of the numbers. So it's just, I don't really do a whole lot of this. This is where I see you use it the most. Font variant, small caps. There we go. Small caps, all small caps. So small caps is, the capital letter D is still bigger than all the other letters, but all small caps is, they're all the same size.
Okay.
Interesting content, difficult waffles. Line height is like all those English papers that you guys write and you're trying to, you're trying to like double space or triple space your line height so you can fit more on a page, because your assignment's to write one page content, so you increase the line height to fool your English teachers. Turns out that's also really important, and line height's really important to make readable text, right? So CSS is really powerful and very granular, in that you can change things pixel by pixel, inch by inch, line height and letter spacing, the spacing between individual letters, and word spacing, and again line height. Man, you can get really nitty gritty with CSS. So here's all these properties: font style, font variant, font weight. I will tell you, these font weight of 700 versus 900, historically this was not supported very well, but it's better nowadays. So font weight of bold is like a font weight of 700. Font weight of normal is the same as 400. Line heights. And finally, there's a shorthand for font, and this is pretty awesome. One font property to set something as italic, bold, the pixels of the font, the line height of the font, the font family is Arial, and then fallback of sans serif. You can do so much with this font property. Small caps, 150% is the size, Times New Roman. You can change the order of this. Size and family are required, the rest are optional. So font size being 14 pixels, 150%, 90%, the rest are optional. Family being Comic Sans, Times New Roman, or Arial. So I'm really a big fan of this shorthand font property. You can move things over with CSS. You can align them to the left, center, or right. Vertical align, bottom, middle, baseline, or top. There's so much here. Text decoration, again, we did that with the underline, overline, line through. There's so much here. One thing that I've learned early on about text shadows is you want to use them minimally. Like you want to have a small shadow that might add a little bit of an effect on a heading or something, but you can definitely overuse shadows, and like that's ugly, right? So be careful. Even that, I don't know, just I'm not a big fan of. Maybe you guys like the way that looks better than me, but
Kind of reminds me of like websites from the 90s.
exactly. It's just it looks old. It looks old.
Yeah,
All right.
That actually reminds me of those old GeoCities sites.
It does. Yeah, those old GeoCity sites, right? I mean, I can tolerate this, right? You got a nice dark shadow, kind of gives it like a 3D effect. So shadows should generally be darker, preferably a black. Too much shadow is hard for the visually impaired. Be consistent with the directions of your shadows. So shadows, you could put it to the top left, bottom right. And that's what this text shadow property does. Top. We got to talk about what this does. Obviously, the color is red. This means 2 pixels.
And it top right, bottom.
Well, just look at the shadow here. So it's on the top left. So the 4 pixels is to the left. We got 4 pixels to the left. 2 pixels on the top. Okay, so let's talk about something here. I want to talk about this because this is the hardest one to remember, but it is important. When you start seeing these values that have 3 numbers and 2 numbers and 1 number, let's do something here. Okay, so I'm going to make a paragraph, lorem ipsum, and then solid red. Okay. If I say margin, top, so 0 pixels on the top, I'll set, instead of margin, I'll do padding. Padding, and I'll talk about the difference. 0, top, right, bottom, left. So when I have 4 numbers for one, so 4 values for one property, it goes top, right, bottom, left, like clockwise, right? Top, right, bottom, left. So what this does is it adds 10 pixels of padding to the left. And what that actually does is you can see now there's 10 pixels where the content is 10 pixels away from the border on the left. Okay, so if I add 100 pixels to the top, top, right, bottom, left, it looks like PX. Don't forget the PX. Looks like that. Okay, so top, right, bottom, let's add some to the bottom. Top, right, bottom, let's just do 50 pixels PX on the bottom. Okay, so padding is moving things around inside of the box, and that's why I chose padding. I just want to move the content around inside of the box. Okay, now if I do 2 numbers, let's just do 50 pixels, 100 pixels. This is top and bottom, left and right. Top and bottom, left and right. Top and bottom is 100 pixels. Left and right is 50 pixels. Now, there's not actually enough lorem ipsum in here for you to see the right padding, so let me add some more text. Now you can see the padding on both sides. It wasn't stretched out long enough to see the padding. So now we do my least favorite of the bunch, and let's do 10 pixels. So now we have 3 numbers. I believe this is going to go top, bottom, left and right. No, top, left and right, bottom. Top 100. Top is 100. Left and right is 50. 10 pixels is bottom. Top, left and right, bottom. So those are what those values mean, and that's kind of what I'm looking at here. 2, 2, 4, top, left and right, bottom, and that doesn't really seem to match what the picture shows. So that's why I'm finding that confusing. But I'm not going to battle it right now. Moving on. Wow, what a chapter. What a chapter. A lot of good information in here. I'm going to stop the recording.